Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our session. Hi, I'm Allison Van Holt, and I am the chair of the Recruitment and Retention Committee. I welcome you today to
You may need to be closer. Mine seems to be working.
Hi, can you hear me better now? All right, thank you. Sorry about that. I am Allison Van Holt, and I'm the chair of the Recruitment and Retention Committee. I thank you for joining us today for this Recruitment and Retention Committee update, as well as the Take Action session. Before we get started, I would like to say that the Recruitment and Retention Committee acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land and the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We thank them. We acknowledge that other peoples were here before us. All right, and so we're going to go ahead and get started with our session. I'm asking Dr. Charles Blanky to give us a little intro.
Thanks so much. I'm actually going to start this off with not one, but two apologies. First of all, many of you heard some of these similar comments this morning at the Patient Advocates Committee meeting, so bear with me. And secondly, I have to leave very shortly, not because I think this is not an important committee meeting, but because I have to attend the Hope Board. I find myself strangely busy at group meeting these days. So first of all, I am so happy and so impressed with the variety and quality of people leading our DEI efforts. And that, of course, includes so many people that are actually here in this room. I will not acknowledge you all by name, but I do acknowledge all of you. Secondly, I think most of you are familiar with the Pope Consultation that we had fairly recently for leadership. It was very uncomfortable, but it was very necessary and it was very beneficial. I'll flat out say that Pope called our DEI efforts immature and early stage, but they did see hope for some progression and steady improvement already. So we have a lot of work to do, but we are more than willing to do it. I'm also, on an individual basis, happy with our DEI fellow, our DEI champion program, and our new DEI monitoring committee. Now, one thing we really, really need, despite the existence of this committee, is a senior leader who is solely focused on DEI. This vice chair for DEI will provide strategic and tactical oversight of all of our efforts. So I imagine you'll be working very, very closely with that person. The candidacy application period just ended on April 1st. It's probably going a little bit more slowly than we hoped it would, to be very honest, but we are definitely going to take our time and ensure that we bring on the right person. And finally, I don't know if you're planning on talking about this today, but I do strongly support a name change to better reflect your contribution to SWOG. So I'm just so happy for the existence of this committee, and I'm happy to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Bunky. All right, so we're going to go ahead and begin our session. So in addition to our giving an update, we'll do the first 30 minutes will be our RRC update, and then we will shift to our Take Action series, where we are going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion with American Indian populations. That would be great. I'm taking off my mask so you can hear me a little bit better. I am vaccinated. All right.
You can control what they're presenting.
Okay.
So through that one.
Gotcha. What do I point to advance? Okay.
Look to the right. Hey, everybody.
Okay. All right. So while cancer impacts all of us, clinical trials to improve cancer care and outcomes do not currently serve all of us equitably. SWOG and the Hope Foundation for Cancer Research in collaboration with Genentech have launched a multi-phased, multi-year initiative to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion among SWOG leadership, membership, and throughout its clinical cancer trials.
Someone to catch it.
And we do believe that we have an imperative to diversify our clinical trials. We, the research community, have to be willing to acknowledge that we are not doing enough to understand the impact of racial, ethnic, and cultural barriers to clinical trials participation and to remove those barriers. The barriers may be financial or due to trust or language barriers or other issues. And we must think about participant diversity early in the process of developing new research and not as an afterthought, as I think as all of us recognize that we need funding and additional resources to engage populations who are not typically part of the research, part of our clinical research. And we must be in agreement that the recruitment of diverse patient populations is not only important in terms of health equity, but also that it's scientifically important. We recognize that research that only focuses on certain groups will not necessarily translate to all populations. So with support from Hope Foundation and Genentech, we have developed an organizational structure to start addressing DEI and SWOG. And that includes, and I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, having a vice chair for diversity, equity, inclusion, and professional integrity as part of this, someone to lead and coalesce all the different efforts. A DEI implementation fellow who we have on board, an advisory board for DEI champions who are on board already and doing a great job, and a DEI monitoring committee, which is in development. And then, of course, we have the Recruitment and Retention Committee. We have a Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Strategic Working Group, the Patient Advocate Committee, and SWOG members. We all play a role in diversity, equity, inclusion. The ones that are in red are some of our new initiatives. So our RRC, we advise the leadership team on effective methods for recruiting and retaining minority patients into SWOG trials. As Dr. Blanke mentioned earlier, we have been talking about or considering changing the name of the Recruitment and Retention Committee to something that may be more along the lines of diversity and inclusion. We also are working to help recruit and retain minority SWOG members and leaders. And we believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are part of the guiding principles of SWOG, and having diversity in membership and leadership and as participants in our clinical trials is part of our strategic plan. We also give presentations to SWOG committees, and we have the Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Working Group. So to give you a little bit more detail about our Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Strategic Working Group, which we also call DIBS, our mission there is to promote diversity and inclusion among SWOG members conducting cancer research and in those participating in the research. And our vision is that the SWOG leadership and membership will be inclusive and support and advocate for a role and enroll a representative populations into SWOG clinical trials. And we will work in concert with the named DEI vice chair and advisory board to assess the implementation of diversity and inclusion improvement plans across SWOG and its trial participants. Other strategic roles that are in development are the vice chair for DEI, and this person will be accountable for and empowered to ensure DEI across SWOG, leadership, staff, membership, representative accrual, and all related oversight. And we also are developing a DEI advisory board to guide, refine, and validate DEI strategies and the DEI strategic plan, and to monitor SWOG's delivery toward those strategic goals. We have selected Dr. Patricia Robinson as the DEI Implementation Fellow, and she's responsible for collecting and analyzing baseline data of representativeness in clinical trials participants in SWOG. She is also developing a survey for the membership and leadership. One thing that we've been working on quite a bit is the fact that in order to understand where we're going, we have to know where we are. And so that is why many of you may have participated in some of the in some surveys to ask about why it is, or ask more about so that we can have a better understanding of the diversity within our membership and leadership. So when you see those surveys, fill them out, respond, that'd be great. She has a goal of helping achieve 20%, a 20% increase in the enrollment of minorities and underserved in selected SWOG trials, and to implement the Team Science Module 6 with the DEI champions. And I will be saying more about all of those things in a few minutes. We have our DEI champions, who we are extremely excited about. So they are working with research committees and study teams to identify action plans to increase diversity and equity in committee trial portfolios, and to improve the representativeness of participants in specific trials. Their goal is to provide evidence-based strategies for increasing DEI and SWOG research, and they are experts who were selected to provide tools and strategies and help implement increased DEI efforts. And they are tasked with helping to activate Module 6, the Team Science at SWOG, and 5 champions have been selected. If the DEI champions are here, I'd love it if you would stand up. So we have Manuel Espinoza-Guitarra. Did Dr. Guitarra make it here? Komar Figueroa Mosley. Yay. Lucy Gansauer. Jessica McDermott. Dr. Gayatri Nagaraj is not here. She is remote, but we thank her for her work as well. We are developing a DEI monitoring committee to evaluate the results of the both activated as well as closed SWOG trials, and to ensure that leadership, investigators, and members have robust and feasible recruitment goals at the trial and committee level that support SWOG's strategic plans for diversity and representativeness in clinical trial participants. So, we really have to recognize that we have to have goals on the front end, but they also have to be reasonable and to make sense given the locations of the various clinical trial teams. So it's important that we have a group who can help us monitor that and set realistic goals. So the team is going to be composed of an executive officer or committee chair, someone from biostats, a member of the recruitment and retention committee, a patient advocate member, someone from operations, an external expert, a site PI, and a study chair. And to emphasize what Dr. Blanky said earlier, we are still looking for a study chair to apply. So we'd love for that representation to be on the team. Just in general, we're thinking that the members may serve up to two or 3 years. The DEI monitoring committee will vote on the chair, who will serve for up to 2 terms of 3 years each. And they will provide recommendations to the DEI vice chair. And an important initial activity will be that we will need to determine what, if any relationship the DEI MC should have to the existing data safety monitoring committee, which operates under SWOG policy. I want to bring attention to some of the SWOG member resources for DEI. In your when you went to registration, in your bag, in your packet, you should have found the Team Science Field Guide and a copy of the also the methodology. So please refer to those. And as well as those of you who are here virtually should have access to a link to the field guide. And this is, and we also have the Module 6 training for all SWOG members that is online. And we want to encourage all leadership and study chairs to take that training. We want to announce that we're going to have a meet and greet for individuals who are interested in diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'd like to know who everyone is and everyone who wants to work in those directions. So at the reception on Friday from 6:45 to 8:30 in the level 3 foyer, we're going to have some tables set up. We're going to get to know each other and talk about DEI and what we all can do. And you'll see balloons and cookies and other things. So please come join us. So the Take Action series, we have had a few sessions of this, which will begin, we'll have our next session in just a few minutes. And it was developed by our education committee, subcommittee, who are Kamara and Lucy. And the first one was looking at ensuring health equity among African Americans. We had an awesome session with Edith Mitchell, Dr. O, Electra Pasquette, and Marbella Ford. The last one that we had back in the fall was looking at health equity and SWOG trials among Asian Americans. And we had Dr. Lee, Dr. Ngueno, Dr. Akoba, and Dr. Huang. It's fantastic. And today's Take Action series we'll be looking at ensuring equity in clinical research with American Indians. That's today. And we are planning for fall of this year to have a Take Action focused on Hispanic and Latino populations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I just want to give you a little bit more information about the work of the Pope Consulting Group. So as part of our DEI efforts, we were able to secure support from Pope Foundation and Genentech to hire a consulting group to help us better understand equity and inclusion in SWOG. And I just wanted to, I'm not going to go through all of the results, but I did want to point to just a few things. So the Pope Consulting Group, who has worked with a number of different companies of different types, different sizes, first, their methods were that they conducted leadership interviews, anonymous focus groups, used this feedback to tailor a leadership training, conducted an initial leadership training, and provided a summary to us, as well as recommendations for how to move forward. Some of you may have participated in some of these efforts. And their strategy is to, or their pillars are to look at the strategy of an organization, the structure, the systems, and the practices that all support diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just wanted to point out a couple, just a few questions that were asked and some of the results. So one question that was asked was, does SWOG have a role in ensuring that its clinical trial participants are representative of study populations? And the great news about that was that the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people who were polled responded that, yes, we do have a role in that. And that is important, that diversity, inclusion, and equity don't lie just with study chairs or just with the biostatisticians or just with the study team, but that we all have a role to play in providing representation among participants. Which of the following concerns you the most regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion in SWOG? And it seems like one of the main areas of concern was whether leadership will have a sustained commitment to diversity and inclusion. So is this the flavor of the month? Is this just for now, or are we, really dedicated and committed? Do we believe in the imperative that we just talked about earlier in this presentation? So I think that's one concern, with also with much lesser concerns about whether this is not real change. It seems like people are concerned that our leadership will not maintain DEI as an important part of our imperative. And rate how SWOG is doing in terms of having a diverse population of leaders and members. And that's important because if we think that we're doing great, then we probably aren't going to work as hard to try to make change. And so, as you can see, most of us responded that we're doing a good to fair job, but very few think that we're doing either poorly or excellent. So for the most part, we have something to work with. We think that that we have room for improvement. So some of the recommendations that were given to us by Pope, I won't go into great detail with these, but include institutionalizing accountability for inclusion. If no one's responsible, then there may not be change or the emphasis to change. Sustainability of DEI efforts, and again, looking at creating a DEI commitment statement and recommending someone who owns DEI as part of their role, ergo our vice chair, including institutional organizational structures to support DEI growth. So establishing inclusive communications, developing bench strength, and making sure that education for DEI and SWOG among the leaders, members, that everyone gets some level of training. Building systems to foster DEI through the organization. So also making sure that we have ways to operationalize the diversity, equity, inclusion, and being intentional and consistent in our talent acquisition. So if we want members and leaders to be diverse, we have to go out and make sure that we're training for that and promoting them forward. And then implementation practices. So staff and member listening sessions, benchmarking with our counterparts, et cetera. That's about it for me. I just also want to say that I thank our recruitment and retention committee members for always working so hard with us, and how important it is that we have a team that is really dedicated to trying to affect change in cancer clinical trials. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? And we're going to ask, if you do have questions here in the audience, that you would go to the microphone and give your comments or questions. And those who are virtual, if you could put your comments in the chat.
Okay.
All right, so if there are no questions or comments, I thank all of you for your patience, and we are going to move to the Take Action series.
So did you want to see the?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so we have three fantastic panelists for this next Take Action series, which is American Indians Ensuring Equity in Clinical Research. Our first presenter is going to be Dr. Ronnie Bell. And Dr. Bell is a member of the Lumbee tribe and is a professor of social sciences and health policy, Associate Director of Community Outreach and Engagement, and Director of the Office of Cancer Health Equity at Wake Forest School of Medicine. And so we will ask Dr. Bell to begin his presentation.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay. And you can see my slides in presentation mode?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Kate.
Actually, Dr. Bell,
Yes.
give us just one moment, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Those that are logged in can see your slides, but the ones that we're in the room, we do not see your slides yet. So we're just waiting to see them presented.
Okay.
While we're waiting, this Take Action series has been designed to help sites and researchers who do not formally work with American Indian populations. And several academic programs have very robust, culturally based programs, such as the ones that we're going to be hearing from today. So this is sort of a hopefully will expand all of our knowledge about working with American Indian populations. It's a lot.
While we're waiting for our tech issues, I'd like to also just tell you a little bit about the other presenters. We also have on the line, oh, now we can see. Dr. Bell, we can see you.
Okay, but I can't see my slides now.
Oh, boy. Okay, we can't see your slides either.
I thought he was gonna share a screen.
Oh, can you share your screen?
Yes,
Or
I
would-
think. How about now?
Yes, perfect.
Yay. All right. So I just wanted to thank Dr. Caven Holt and the Planning Committee for inviting me to be a part of this very illustrious panel and to share my thoughts on this topic. So my goal is really to sort of give you a general understanding as much as I can in 20 minutes about the American Indian population. And when we talk about the American Indian population, as I try to advance my slides here, something's gone wrong. Okay, so when we think about the American Indian population, we oftentimes feel like a forgotten community or a forgotten population, and this was kind of illustrated in the 2020 election. CNN did an exit poll and asked the racial and ethnic demographics of the respondents to the poll, and so they show, as you can see here, they had 65% white, 13% Latino, 12% Black, 3% Asian, and then some generic category called something else, which was 6%. And so a lot of people in the Native community thought, well, I guess we're just kind of lumped into this sort of ambiguous category called something else. But the reality is that the American Indian, or the population that is identified as American Indian Alaska Native, is very vibrant, as you can see from this map here, are represented across the United States. In the 2020 census, about 4.5 million people identified as American Indian Alaska Native alone, which represents about 1.3% of the US population. And you can see sort of where there are large concentrations of American Indian people. And I'll just note to you from a historical perspective is that many of the places where American Indian people now live, they are there by US policy. They were forcefully removed from their tribal homelands. And so, as I said, we have about 4.5 million people who identify as American Indian Alaska Native only, but the US Census allows for people to identify as more than one race. And so if you were to include those people who identify as American Indian Alaska Native plus one other race, then that number jumps up to about 9 million people. And you can see that to their credit, the US Census has done a good job of trying to not only identify American Indian Alaska Native people, but also allow for the reporting of tribe or people group to get a better sense of the size of individual tribes across the U.S. And as we think about the diversity of our American Indian Alaska Native communities across the country, we obviously have to keep in mind that these tribal communities have variations in culture and traditions, certainly have differences in their history and in particularly their contact with Europeans. Obviously, differences in geography, not just across the United States, but also whether they're living in rural communities or urban communities. Our tribal communities vary drastically in size from populations as large as 500,000 to tribes as small as less than 1,000. But then our tribes also vary with regard to recognition status. And so there are about 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. 229 of those live in Alaska. And when we think about this concept of tribal recognition, citizens of federally recognized tribes, they have sovereign entity or sovereign status within their tribal nation, as well as within the states and counties in which they live. And so this federal recognition designation allows for a government to government relationship with the US government, and the boundaries or the rules of engagement for that relationship is oftentimes established through the treaty process. And I would point you to this really nice resource from the National Congress of American Indians, which talks about the history of the relationship of tribal nations with the United States. And so tribes can obtain federal recognition through a number of processes, either through act of Congress, through an executive order from the president, but through a decision of the U.S. court or other types of federal actions. And there are specified 7 cultural, historical, and structural criteria which are outlined by the U.S. government to have this federal recognition process be aligned. And most recently, there were 6 tribes in the state of Virginia, largely concentrated in southeastern Virginia, who all obtained federal recognition through this process. Where I'm at in North Carolina, we have 8 tribes. Only one of those is recognized by the federal government. That's the Eastern Band Cherokee Indians, which is on the Qualla boundary in the western part of the state. These are the descendants of those individuals, those tribal members who hid in the Appalachian Mountains during the forced removal for the Trail of Tears. And so they are the federally recognized tribe in our state. We also have 7 state recognized tribes. My tribe, the Lumbee tribe in the southeastern part of the state, along with the Coharie and the Waccamaw in the southeast. We have the Meherrin and Halawa Saponi in the northeastern part of the state, and the Saponi Nation and the Okadichi Band of Saponi Nation in the north central part of the state. We also have 4 urban Indian centers in our 4 largest cities in the state, in Charlotte, Raleigh, Greensboro, and Fayetteville. And so one of the benefits of being a federally recognized tribe is that you are eligible for healthcare services. Again, this is by treaty. It's through the Indian Health Service, either on reservation lands or there are also urban Indian healthcare facilities, because many tribal members live off the reservation in urban areas. And the Indian Health Service healthcare includes both primary healthcare services as well as limited dental care. And tribes can also contract with the Indian Health Service to provide, so the Indian Health Service can provide funds so the tribe can do tribally directed care. And there are 12 Indian Health Service regions in the United States, and you can see them outlined here. And oftentimes when you see data published on health outcomes for American Indians in the United States, you will often see it both nationally as well as designated by across the 12 Indian Health Service districts. You can see in particular the United States, in the eastern part of the United States, the Nashville area covers a very large geographic area, but that's largely because there aren't, as you saw in the map I showed earlier, there aren't that many tribes in the eastern United States. And so unfortunately, COVID really sort of illuminated some of the health challenges that we see in American Indian communities. We saw early on in the global pandemic, we saw that people of color were adversely affected by COVID, and we saw that the Navajo Nation had at one point one of the largest infection rates of any community in the United States. And if we look at some of the major indicators for the impact of COVID in tribal communities, so the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations of those that get diagnosed, and the number of people who die, the disparities for American Indians and Alaska Natives are pretty substantial. And we see that largely because of what we see. And this is a wonderful paper that just came out a couple of days ago by Solomon College, which talks about how racism and structural racism and some of the impacts, historical impacts on American Indian people have led now to what we see as the devastating impact of COVID-19. And another report that I would point you to is a report by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which looked at 27 indicators, social and health-related indicators, and showed that this graphic shows that in the orange color here, those are the indicators, the number of indicators where that population is worse off than the non-Hispanic white population. And you can see that for the African-American population, it's 19 of those 27, but for the American Indian population, they have the second largest number of these adverse health indicators, adverse social and health indicators. So 17 of the 27 are worse for American Indians than Alaska Natives. And we also need to be mindful of, as I mentioned, the historical as well as contemporary trauma that is occurring in tribal communities. So I mentioned the forced removal policy of the US government, but also the boarding school policy that where Native children were taken from their homes and their cultures were stripped away from them, and as well as what we're seeing now with the trauma on tribal communities from the large number of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I just want to give credit to Secretary Deb Haaland, who's the first American Indian woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. She has brought light to these issues, and particularly we have now the May 5th as the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And similar to what we see in other communities of color, there's been exploitation of Native people in the research process. Probably the most famous of those issues is the Havasupai tribe, who there were researchers at a university in the southwestern part of Arizona State University, where they were accused of, these researchers were accused of using samples of Havasupai tribal members for purposes that they were not intended to be used for. And I want to point you to another really nice resource that just recently came out. This is the American Cancer Society Facts and Figures for 2022. This is probably a resource that you've used quite a bit, but the 2022 issue has a special section on American Indians and Alaska Natives. And this has some really great data, and it points to some of the many issues that speak to the disparities that we see in cancer, in certain cancers for American Indians and Alaska Natives. And this is one table here that speaks to some of these social determinants of health where we see the sort of adverse impacts in tribal communities across the country. The other thing that we see that particularly impacts cancer is that we see some degree of racial misclassification, where American Indian people are inappropriately classified as some other race or ethnicity, which has tremendous impacts on understanding the burden of cancer in American Indian Alaska Native populations. We had a study done here in North Carolina back in 2008, and the researchers were able to show a 19% underestimation of the true cancer incidence among American Indians as a direct result of racial misclassification in the cancer registry. And so, as it's pointed out in the really nice AACR Cancer Disparities Progress Report of 2020, we need to think about, as we're working with communities of color, thinking about ways to enhance diversity of trials. And this is something that I applaud your efforts in doing this through this series and the other work that you're doing in SWOG. But we need to address, structural barriers, clinical barriers, and logistical barriers as it relates to enhancing diversity. And there's some really nice resources out there. These are just two. I also, my colleagues on this panel also have really great resources, but these are two, one from the Center for Indigenous Cancer Research at the Roswell Park Cancer Center. Dr. Rodney Herring runs that center, and then the American Indian Cancer Foundation, Melissa Buffalo's organization. They have really nice educational resources on to educate tribal members about participating in cancer clinical trials. Another great resource that I would point you to is a policy paper by the National Congress of American Indians called Walk Softly and Listen Carefully. And this resource is specifically designed to help researchers who are interested in working in tribal communities in the research space. And I would highlight these 5 recommendations in that report. Number 1, indigenous knowledge is valid and valued. Culture is always a part of research, and thus research cannot be culturally neutral. Responsible stewardship includes the task of learning how to interpret and understand data and research. Number 4, tribes must exercise sovereignty when conducting research and managing data. And the last is research must benefit Native people. And so as we think about the ways in which we can be effective in recruiting American Indian people into cancer trials, we have to think about a lot of different logistical factors, like, many tribes have their own institutional review board, or at least a approval process of research in their communities that must go through the tribal government. And also that it's important that you're not just coming in where, oftentimes in academia, we're accused of swooping into communities and then leaving, that we really need to understand that the research needs to align with the priorities of the community. And it's also, it's very important in this recruitment process to use appropriate language. I mean, many of the tribes across the country have their own unique language, but even they may use different English words for things that are not common in other communities. And also imagery is very, very important. And so it's critical to understand what images, what words, what language is important to that tribal community, and clearly understanding the importance of disseminating the study findings to the community once the study is done. And I would point you to a really nice YouTube video that NCI did called A Seat at the Table, Culturally Based Cancer Research among American Indians and Alaska Natives. It's about 4 minutes long, but it's really a great resource if this is something that you're interested in. So in closing, I would just say to you that not just for cancer, but across many different health outcomes, American Indians and Alaska Natives experience significant health disparities, many of which are driven by the social determinants of health. And we need to understand that the history as it relates to research and how that history has led to mistrust of scientists, and how it's important in the facilitation process of research that you go into this with the appropriate strategy for communication, collaboration, and mutual respect. And I would use the imagery to the right here of the medicine wheel, the 4 colors, the 4 directions as guidance in this whole process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bell, for starting us off with that great presentation. We're going to ask that we keep the questions toward the end. And so we're going to move on to our next presenter, and that is going to be Dr. Linda Burhan-Stepanoff. I've been practicing, who is a member of the Cherokee Nation, and she founded the Native American Cancer Research Corporation, NACR, and the Native American Cancer Initiatives, NACI. Dr. B, are you there?
I'm here. Can you see my slides?
We sure can. You can go ahead and begin.
Great. Hey, great job, Ronnie. Thank you very much. Quick, and you hit so many of the good highlights. And I think an underlying thing, besides not wanting to be called something else, is that when SWOG's looking to create these policies, This is not a one-time thing. We're looking for a long-term investment with our communities as partners. We need infrastructure that extends beyond whoever the current leadership is in SWOG or in any other organization. This is a very, very significant issue for us. So very, very much, please consider long-term, not just a quick fix, because right now equities or something we're looking at. Well, we're around all the time. We're around when we're not a fad. And we want to continue being here. And one of the ways we can do this is through clinical trials. So I have a couple of objectives. One is that I want you to see that an easy strategy that you can use, not just for bringing more Indigenous people into clinical trials, but really for all underserved populations and underrepresented populations, frequently is through the use of navigators. And in our program, we call them Native sisters, Native brothers. They're cultural navigators as well. And they make a world of difference. And I'm going to identify a couple of things that have happened in clinical trials and why there have been some problems with this. I do want you to know that I'm quite biased. I think clinical trials is the most likely way for our patients to get access to standard care and to quality care. We do not have oncologists in any place in the lower 48 within Indian Health Service or in urban Indian clinics. We only in Alaska, and they're very underserved there. And Alaska is as large as the lower 48. And as Ronnie was explaining, we live in all states. He highlighted the states where there's a lot of us, but I've lived back east. I've lived in a lot of the areas where your programs are running. We are very often an invisible population, but maybe we are something else. I don't know. Maybe that's a good thing. Who knows? But clinical trials, and I've worked with cancer patients for over 30 years, Indigenous cancer patients. And I can tell you, those patients who get into clinical trials have a higher quantity of life, higher quality of life. And there's different efforts that you have to take part in to open the doors to our people to be able to benefit from clinical trials. So I'm very, very biased in support of clinical trials. And we developed a curriculum, Clinical Trials Education for Native Americans, which is on our website. The older slides are in 2005. When we're training navigators on how to understand clinical trials or how to work with the patient and bring the patient into the recruiter that's at the cancer center or wherever it happens to be, we've gone through this 3 times. And it's very interesting because the navigators will say, oh, these slides were so much better than last time. We never changed the slides. The difference is level of readiness. And level of readiness affects a lot of people. It affects all different groups. This is not unique to my people. It's to all people. Clinical trials are hard to understand. You all know that. You remember what it was like trying to explain it. When I talk to my community about clinical trials, they think that somebody at the local Indian Health Service is being sued. That's what a clinical trial is. So there's a different level of readiness, of ways of explaining things. I was going to show you an excerpt of a video. My husband is recapturing it now. We realized that the older version that I had was not there. It was produced by Mayo Clinic. It's called Clinical Trials, A Gift to Our Children. And even though it's older, it was made in 2005. Wonderful woman put this together for our community. It is still very, very meaningful, and we still show it at our community events, and the community still like it. We do use websites such as this that's on the screen. I have found the people on the website, there's night and day difference from how well people talk with us. And in general, we try to train our navigators on how to kind of go through a synopsis or step-by-step, how to get to the clinical trial recruiter. So the patient talks with the navigator, and then the patient tells the navigator of his concerns, maybe just diagnosed with multiple myeloma. The navigator talks with the clinical trial recruitment professional, and they determine what potential locations or what types of category clinical trial might be relevant. Now, this is a step where our training has been essential, because the navigator has to understand basics of clinical trials to even know how to talk to the recruiter and simultaneously how to talk to the patient in a way that makes sense to the patient and that the patient realize he or she is really not going to be a guinea pig, because that is the first perception of everybody in our community, just as it is for almost all people who live in poverty and people who are underserved and underrepresented. So you look at the different types or the different categories for this, and then we schedule an appointment with the clinical trial recruiter, with the patient, and with the native patient navigator. That little acronym NPN is Native Patient Navigator. Again, in our program, we've called them Native Sisters and Native Brothers since 1994. And we go in with questions. And so our navigators work with the patient and really get to what they're most concerned about. And it is almost never what the healthcare provider is concerned about, almost never. It's things like, will I be so sick from this clinical trial that I cannot watch my daughter graduate from high school? They have very, very different issues, rather than how, when we're working directly with the patient, we're thinking about late effects, long-term effects, any of these types of things. And so then we go to the website, or we call 1-800. And again, this website has been very good about answering questions in easy to understand information. Now, in general, our navigators will do this with the patient, because the patient frequently is too uncomfortable to talk directly, and they're afraid they're going to sound stupid or they're going to sound frightened, and they don't want to sound like any of that. So our navigators, we have them practice saying, I'm looking for a treatment trial for multiple myeloma. My patient lives in the Southern California geographic region. We're interested in a phase 2 trial. And this kind of helps move things forward. I think this synopsis works with people in addition to Indigenous people. So there's different issues that are unique. Ronnie already explained a little bit about Havasupai. This is quite devastating throughout our community. Not the first time it's happened. We had uninformed and lack of informed consent for sterilization of 70 to 80,000 American Indian women in the late 1970s. You want to talk about why we don't trust research? Duh. We got a lot of reasons for this. Frequently, we're never even told about the availability of trials, or they're run through so quickly that you can't understand it. Now, you're going to hear an exception to this with Daniel Peterwright, who's going to be speaking right after I'm done. Because what Daniel has done is that he has taken time and he's changed the protocol on how he talks with people about clinical trials and what happens with it. So he's a wonderful, wonderful example of what happens. And Ronnie mentioned going through the tribal committee. If the trial, if recruitment or retention, and retention is just as important as recruitment, if it's being placed anywhere where recruitment's on an IHS facility or tribal facility, you have to go through the tribal council, you have to get approval. Example of this is the Tamoxifen Trial. And this was in the early 1990s, and Warda McCaskill-Stevens came out to my tribe, to Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, and she talked with people about clinical trials and why the Tamoxifen Trial was really important. Absolutely amazing. The people in my neighborhood back in Oklahoma were absolutely astounded that this woman cared enough to come out and talk to our tribal nation about why this was important and what were the issues. And the issues from my tribe were how they were collecting genetic specimens. And we had a lot of valid reasons for why we felt this way. And Warda talked with all of us. So there are keywords that alienate or they confuse potential clinical trial participants. An example of this is the word experiment. Immediately, we think we're going to get a placebo or a sugar pill. We think we don't get the treatment at all. Research is a word that's been so abused in our community, such as what Ronnie brought up, that we never get the results. But I want to tell you another key part of why this happens and how you as researchers can certainly help improve communication. And again, I don't think it's limited to my people. There's so much confusion about how soon results are actually going to be available. Most of the projects that go on our tribe you get feedback within a year. Now, with clinical trials, you may not get feedback ever. It may be 15 years. Even if it's a 5-year study, you may need to tell people you're not going to be able to get results for 5 years. We have to be a lot more upfront and clear about that, because people think, yeah, they never told us anything. Well, the study's not done yet. That's why they haven't said anything. And so it creates more and more distrust. The word protocol, and all of us who work in cancer centers or work around any of this, we use protocol all the time. It has absolutely no meaning in my community. It's not a commonly understood term. So you have to break down some things into more commonly used phrases. This is the step-by-step process that we do when we're doing treatment for this type of trial. And of course, clinical trial has no meaning. They've tried for years, at least 30 years, coming up with a different term other than clinical trial, and nobody has come up with something better. So we have to find a way to explain it in a more gentle manner when we're talking with potential participants. And again, not unique just to us. Example of very unsuccessful recruitment strategies are going to be advertising in the newspaper, doing telephone recruitment. I love when they do random digit dialing. That's always fun on Indian country. Using culturally irrelevant materials. Ronnie mentioned how the materials have to be tailored to different groups. I remember when I was working at the National Cancer Institute, we had a product we were testing in Indian country, and it went up to the Northeast. And in that community, red was only reserved for sacred items and sacred issues. And we had red in part of the text that was on the book, and the tribe threw a fit on it. So you really have to test things in local groups. And frequently there are materials that, you have these programs in like Word to help you make things of a lower literacy level. And the average literacy level for all of US is about grade 7. And what happens is people apply the formulas wrong. They'll do it to the whole document, not realizing that one paragraph is written at grade 16 and the next bullet that comes under it is written at grade 5. So it averages out, and that's not how to make a good recruitment or retention material. We've also found it helps to have same-sex working. If it's a breast trial for women, then women need to do the recruitment. If it's a prostate trial for men, men are better recruiters. Now, women can get away with it because we tend to handle so many of the health issues within our immediate families. But it's much harder for a male outreach worker to do things for a women's program. A great waste of money and time is going through voter registration list or census list. And there's a lot of stories about that. Another is using celebrities. There's nothing like having a Hollywood celebrity come out to Ronnie's community at Lumbee and trying to deliver some message. No way. We want someone local, a local celebrity, and someone you may not think of as a celebrity. It might be a traditional male healer, and that may be the best celebrity for that particular program. A lot of people like to do education with the church, works great in certain areas. African American Baptist Church have done some wonderful, wonderful programs. They have absolutely bombed in Indian country. Because it works with one minority group does not mean it can transfer and work with another minority group. We still have to pilot and test out the materials to make certain we're always being respectful. And if you have general public service announcements and videos, they get almost no one from Indian country. Same thing with radio. And we do a lot with radio because we drive so many long distances in our car. We're all listening to it. And a lot of us have horror stories of what's happened at the county health department or the local general hospital or some specific healthcare facility. You need to know what the history of those are in terms of where you're telling people to come in. If that's a facility where my grandma ended up being sterilized, hey, I'm not going there. No one in my family will ever go there. And then we talk about providers in clinical trials. healthcare providers, you have to have a trusting relationship with your communities and with your patients. And again, my example of this is Daniel Peter Wright. Here you've got this good, gentle radiologist who gets in his car and he drives 1.5 to 2.5 hours to go out and meet with tribal council. And frequently they don't have time for him to even be on the agenda to be able to explain what he's concerned about, what he's seeing with his patients at his hospital. And a lot of times we have issues because our general practitioners, they don't want to lose full contact with their patients. They want to make certain they know they care about their patients, just like oncologists typically do as well. So we need to have improved communication. That, by the way, that is a recommendation that we have been making now for 35 years. There's got to be an easy solution to this. This is silly. This is stupid, actually. And when we talk to Native people, they'll tell us they've never heard clinical trials at all. Didn't the oncologist talk to you about it? Now, what I think is sometimes I think oncologists do, or maybe the oncology nurse, who are absolutely wonderful, by the way, in working with our communities. But it may still be that they don't have enough of a relationship for the patient to be relaxed enough to hear what's being said. They're frightened. They need somebody they know with them in the same room. And that's what our navigators do. And people are biased about, they're not going to comply. And again, navigators can fill that. And keep in mind always, we may do things differently in our community, and we certainly do, but we're not stupid. We want options to make informed decisions about taking part in our treatment. We want to live. We want to see our children do better. So strategies, there's a paper that that was published in 2016 that talks about we need better cohorts. And this is something that SWOG can certainly do. Now we have existing ones. We have Strong Heart study, but we can have things that go beyond the 3 states where Strong Heart has been invested. And people want to be looking at more than just one disease. And we need to look at less expensive ways to support cohorts, especially in light of COVID. Cell phones they're hysterical on the reservation. People will say they have to drive to the valley so they can get a connection, but they have to see their grandchildren. In looking at how many cell phones now we see grandparents and parents, all of them using, is really, really nice. Not great connection all the time. Life course research is another really important area, like looking at prenatal environmental contaminants and the increased risks on the fetus when she gets into her 20s. California has done some wonderful research on this. It's been quite frightening, actually. And we also have to look at different geographic locations, social economic status. Looking at high altitude. I live in the Rocky Mountains. The number of women up here who have pregnancy issues because of the impact of altitude on pregnancy. Well, we think altitude also may impact different types of medication absorption and the use of the medications, and looking at how pollution affects things. These are a few more things that are in the epidemiology paper. And I want to say we have got to find a better way to do cluster research. They're so invasive that the findings are almost never able to be used by the tribe. Do we have clusters of cancer in Indian country? You betcha. And they're in areas where a lot of you are working right now. Childhood cancers are elevated in Northwestern tribal communities. Also, Southern California. Some of you in Southern California right now. You cannot believe the stories that these people go through, and we need our little children. And we have even more devastating stories for little boys than we do for little girls. So we have to integrate new technologies. We talk about historical trauma, and typically scientists have been saying, oh, poo-poo. Well, I'm sorry. Now with epigenetics, it's not so poo-poo. There are reasons why we have so much obesity in our community. And of course, obesity is being a risk factor for cancer. There's so many things we can look at that before we have been denigrated for even raising it as possibly being an issue. And we need to have universal databases that can actually control and support the education of the next generation. This slide, I just want you to take a look at this. And this is also in that same paper. These are how few people, and there's over on the left is showing you what the names of what those acronyms are meaning here. But I want you to also look at where we are with Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. This has got to stop. This is stupid. Asian Americans do not have the same genetic mix. They don't have the same behaviors as Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. We've got to quit grouping these groups together. And we have recommended that when you look at different types of studies that have been done. I think I'm almost over my time. Do you want me to go for one more minute or do you want me to stop?
Please continue.
Okay. Women's Health Initiative. This is a phenomenal missed opportunity. And I know most of you know about the Women's Health Initiative, but it's the biggest study that's ever been done with older women. And it was really, they made an effort to have 20% of the women be from minority populations. Now they reached 17.5. They didn't reach their goal, but that's the highest we've ever had in a clinical trial of anything like this. And the participants were being followed for several years. They had 40 centers, 10 of them were minority, and they had two arms. They had clinical trial and they have observation alone. So these were the two clinical trial arms that they had. And the recruitment process, longer and more difficult than planned. And all I got to say to that is, duh, you got to be kidding. Of course, it's going to take longer. We have to allow greater time for recruitment of underserved and underrepresented populations in any of our clinical trials. Right? They had some things that I said were not successful, news, media, mass mailings, and so on. They had cultural materials, but some of them were really good and some of them were not so good. They had a lot of direct communication with physicians. They did a letter of invitation. They checked it for literacy. They checked it for language. They did some good things. And then they tried to see if they were eligible, what their obesity level was, high blood pressure. The majority of my population is obese and we have high blood pressure. So we have to have ways to bring people into studies who have real conditions. We can't just say, oh, we only want people in perfect health. No, if the majority of my population are obese and they have high blood pressure, that's who needs to be in the clinical trial. So we see how the drugs or how the treatment works. And we did baseline surveys and there were a slew of them. And these were really stupid. Some of the items were good, but some, I'm sorry, how often do American Indian women ballroom dance? Give me a break. How often do we play golf? So some of this stuff, and people say, well, it has to be the same. It has to be standard. What good is it to have a standard questionnaire when it is totally irrelevant to the population and you're collecting bogus data anyway? And that is exactly what happened in many of these studies. So the Arizona site was where they recruited American Indians, but you got to realize some of our largest American Indian populations, as Ronnie brought out, we live in the cities. We live in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. Retention issues, if you look at the Women's Health Initiative, the majority of our women were only in observation. Almost none were in either of the clinical trial arms. So, and they had some things that were not realistic. And again, we need to have protocols that allow for how people live their daily life and what's happening with them. So my bottom line on a lot of this is, why bother recruiting medically underserved communities such as my people into a clinical trial if we're not willing to share the data with them, or to clarify how many years before you're going to get the results? Example of being called something else in that survey that Ronnie shared. We need to break out the results, and we cannot be other. Other is totally worthless to me. When we're in there, then people say, well, where are we? Well, why did they put us in other? I don't care if you combine data from 5 years or 10 years. But I want an American Indian, Alaska Native category in every study that's supported by the federal government. Data at a minimum has to fit the OMB Federal Registry 15. And that means that we've got to report it in all study findings. So combine the years that we want. And my bottom line for a lot of this, I think centers in any research center, any academic center that continues to produce saying there's insufficient numbers for this, I don't think they should be eligible from NIH for minority supplements, for centers of excellence, or for anything else. We are part of the United States. We live differently. We are dying at higher levels. We need to be included. We want to live and we want to contribute to society in a good way. So take a look again at how you're recruiting, but also retention. I was going to give you another example of another study, and it ends out there are 35,000 women in the study, and of that there were 26,000 women in the study, of which 35 were American Indian. Of those 35 women, only 23 made it to the end of the study. Now, inquiring minds want to know why. Did we have so many side effects? Does that mean that the drugs that they were using in that trial had a different impact on our genome? Because that's what I want to know. So you need to have special efforts. And again, large scale, you need to help work with long-term partnerships so that we have infrastructure to continue to be involved with your cancer centers so that we can have a good life. And it's an ongoing process with all this. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk. And I'm happy after Daniel's done answering any questions, and I will stop the share.
Dr. B, giving us so much to think about in terms of our strategies and as well as pitfalls. We're going to hold the questions till the end and allow Dr. Peter Wright to do his presentation, and then we will have a Q&A session. Thank you.
All right, can you hear and see me okay? I can flip the slides. I have two monitors.
Yeah, we can see you. We don't see slides yet. Let me introduce you really quick, and then we'll let you get started. So Dr. Peter Wright is a radiation oncologist and is a PI of the Walking Forward Cancer Disparity Program. He has published on the establishment of trust within tribal communities. So Dr. Peter Wright, you can go ahead and try to screen share.
Okay, I'm doing that now. Do you see my slides yet or not?
No, you must be on your other screen.
Okay, let me just escape for a second here.
Sure.
I'm on share screen, or I thought. There we go. We're getting close.
We can see your slides. You're just not in presentation mode yet.
Yep, I'll flip. I was practicing during Linda B, so this would be seamless. How about now? We good?
So we can still see your there we go. All
Okay,
right, you're good.
All right. Well, thank you. It's an honor to share the stage with Dr. Bell, and especially Dr. Burhan Stipanoff, who is dear to my heart. She's helped us for over 20 years. I also want to thank Dr. Kevin Holt for inviting me to be part of this group. And I also want to acknowledge Dr. Blanky. So interestingly, Dr. Blanky was my senior internal medicine attending when I was a first year internal medicine resident back in 1989. So Dr. Blanky, congratulations on being the SWOG chair, and hopefully we'll get a chance to connect in person someday. So my disclosures are as follows. We have a lot of foundational funding to support our staff. We were currently being funded by an R01 for our palliative care project, and recently completed my presidency's American Brachytherapy Society. So brachytherapy themes will emerge as we go through this. These were the objectives that I was tasked to address today, and I will directly or indirectly address almost all these, but I want to do it in the categories of, or this is kind of a story to tell us the rationale of why we developed this cancer disparity program, the importance of patient navigation, our results, clinical trials tailored for the community. And I think that's the overarching theme here is what I heard is a goal of SWOG to increase in accrual by 20% for minority populations. And then I want to talk a little bit about an American Brachytherapy Society initiative called 310, as I think it also pertains to clinical trials. So I live in Western South Dakota, the Black Hills, located here. We serve the American Indian, Native American populations of Cheyenne River, Pine Ridge, and Rosebud. There's also a indigenous population in Rapid City, but probably 15 to 20% of our cancer patients are American Indian. So we're seeing these folks all the time, which I think helped to develop the program called Walking Forward. So I'm from the state originally. I was at the University of Wisconsin for 10 years, was on staff there for 5 years. I decided to relocate back in 1999. But back in the days, we're now under an expansion. But as I'm sitting in my nice office here where I'm presenting from today, I have no impact on how patients present. And all oncologists know this, but how patients ultimately are going to do is often how they present in your exam room. And so it didn't take long after I was here for a year or two and I grew up in the state. We looked at our tumor registry data and looked at screen detectable cancers and looked at Native American versus non-Native American. And I'll use American Indian, Native American, and more specifically out here Lakota interchangeably. But this data was really consistent with what we saw in the clinic. Patients were coming with more advanced stages of cancer. And we published this in JCO. A few stats, and you heard this from Dr. Bell, but the Northern Plains American Indians have some of the highest cancer incident and death rates in the United States. In fact, they have the highest death rate from lung cancer. It's over 95%. So there's something going on here. So why is this? What does cancer look like in Native America? We published on this a few years ago. There's high rates of high-risk health behaviors and comorbidities. So they're social stressors. There are low screening rates in the past that have been related to resources such as funding of IHS, trust, remoteness, at times health literacy. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to patients presenting with more advanced stages of cancer. It's been published that ANs get less cancer-directed therapies after a cancer diagnosis than non-Hispanic whites. And some stats from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is about somewhere between 30 to 40,000 people live there. It's a young population. Poverty rates are very high, and they have some of the lowest life expectancy rates in the US. In fact, Monica Bordigelli, the ASCO president, came out here a couple of years ago. In fact, she just dropped into my office. I thought it was somebody else that came in, and she had come out here to kind of determine what was going on. So literally back in 1999, 2000, I hit the road. There aren't interstates going down to the reservations to kind of find out what was going on. The two questions I'm often asked is, how did you start the program and why did you start it? And I was given the opportunity to quote, tell our story a few years ago in one of the journals. So the stars kind of aligned in 2001, where the National Cancer Institute issued what's called the Cdrp Program, and it stands for the Cancer Disparity Research Partnership. And the story really begins from my department chair, Dr. Manesh Mehta, who is a well-known CNS expert, sent me this email that, hey, Dan, you should really look into this opportunity. But the goal was to build and stabilize independent and collaborative clinical research capabilities in institutions providing radiation oncology care to populations experiencing healthcare disparities. You would think this would have gone into a primary care clinic. So we paid in for the grant. Our partners initially were University of Wisconsin with their group, as well as Judith Cower, a Native American medical oncologist. So we put the grant together as an R01. And so how are we going to address these disparities? Well, one is behavioral research assessing barriers to early cancer detection, culturally appropriate community education, comprehensive patient navigation. Of course, as a radiation oncologist, I was really trained in a lot of this. So I reached out to people quickly like Dr. B, Dr. Cower, and others, but I certainly had a lot of experience in the clinical trial realm. And so with collaboration with UW-Madison as well as Mayo, we wanted to develop phase 2 clinical trials for common disease sites, prostate and prostate cancer in particular, to see using brachytherapy and IMRT to address the issue of geographic distance from the cancer center. We're the only cancer center within about a 350-mile radius that offers the services that we do. And the primary hypothesis was, with these interventions, potentially lead to patients presenting with earlier stages of cancer. The distance that they live from the cancer center is about 140 miles. Again, a barrier to cancer treatment could have been at that time the prolongation of treatment time. And again, back in 2002, using some of these innovative technologies as part of a phase 2 trial to shorten the treatment duration. That was just part of the the research question. And enrollment on NCI cooperative group trials was a key priority as well. So we were one of the first 2 institutions that received the grant. There was a total of 6 CDRP sites. The name of the grant initially wasn't Walking Forward, but one of our staff came up with this name. And the idea is that we weren't going to come in and do this study quickly. We were going to take our time, quote, walk forward to find out what some of these issues were. We'll get into how we gained community trust. So these are some of our 20-year highlights. So accrual rates at 10% American Indians at clinical trials. We put 4,500 American Indians on various research studies. A lot of these are social science studies to determine what are some of the barriers to patients receiving treatment. We've demonstrated increased compliance with cancer treatment. We've identified specific barriers to effective cancer screening and care. We've coordinated now over 3,500 cancer screenings. We completed a genetic study I'll talk about in a little bit. Dr. B was critical in helping us complete a randomized controlled trial in smoking cessation. But really, some of the basic ingredients of this have been to do all the above. We've had to develop and establish trusting partnership within the communities, creating infrastructure, research infrastructure in a community hospital. And a lot of this points towards sustainability. How do you keep these programs going when you're not in a major academic center? So this is just an example of what it took initially back in 2003, 2004. Dr. B talked a little bit about this. This almost gives me a headache showing this to you. But for each research study that we had to go through seven separate, so this per study, 7 letters of support, a trip down to each of the reservations to speak to Indian Health Service, Tribal Health Board, and I think at one point we had 4 or 5 IRB protocols. So to just navigate patients on part of a clinical, that was a clinical trial at one point, that took 18 months to launch the study. This is another way of looking at this in a time frame. And the NCI would get grumpy. I would get a call every month about, okay, why aren't you getting more people on study? But this is what's called implementation research. It takes time to get these things off the ground. So these are these are 2 cancer treatment trials over time. These are some of the social science trials, but the ramp up period is at least 12 to 18 months. And that doesn't even include the time we put in before we started. Linda and I published on this, back in 2008, and the title is 10 Lessons for Establishing Trusting Partnerships Within These Communities. And I want to highlight a little bit of this, but part of this is building a foundation of trust prior to grant submission. So I actually went down to all these communities and asked them, is this something that you would be interested in us pursuing? Again, it wasn't the white radiation oncologist saying, I'm going to come in and fix this problem. It was, I'm a treating physician up in Rapid City. We've identified this as an issue. You know, this is a grant possibility. Would you be interested in us submitting this grant? And it was basically an outline, and then we would come back to them and go through the various protocols and how we think this could help. We used a model called CHRs. They're called community health representative, or our community staff, we would call them community research representatives. The model for navigation in these communities, the CHR model, community health representative. But we use that model of employing Lakota folks, LPNs, RNs, community workers, who really kind of are boots on the ground. Patient navigation really became the core of Walking Forward. It includes sharing preliminary and final research findings, consultation. You know, Linda and I detailed this in this manuscript, but for example, for a patient with prostate cancer, even though we had a lot of trials available, the first thing out of my mouth wasn't, do you want to go on this brachytherapy trial? It was, well, let me go through what are the options for your prostate cancer. Near the end of that, we would talk about various trials that we had open. And then if they were interested in a radiation approach as opposed to surgery, at the next meeting, we would talk about, you are potentially eligible for this clinical trial, but there certainly was no coercion or, you know, do you really need to go on this? If it only made sense to the participant. There's been a lot of discussion with Dr. Bell and Dr. B about historical trauma. And you've heard some examples about this related to cancer. You know, one of my concerns was, you know, would I, as a white radiation oncologist, would they be accepting of me to come into the community and try to implement some of these programs? And I think one of the advantages that I had is I was already a treating oncologist out here, so they knew who I was. So navigation, initially for the first 10 years, we had community navigators, we called CRRs. We had cancer navigators within our cancer center. Our community navigation program was really, the goals were to promote education, outreach, networking. They were really the face of walking forward in the tribal communities. Once patients were diagnosed with cancer, then our RN navigators would take over and help them through the complexity of getting to their cancer treatments. So some data to share. This is retrospective. This isn't a randomized trial, but we did look at those patients that were navigated versus not navigated. It was historical comparison. We were able to demonstrate there was improved compliance. This is really important for certain cancers like cervical cancer and head and neck cancer, where treatment prolongation may adversely affect their outcome. About 20% of these patients were enrolled on a clinical trial. Again, a lot of social science surveys. We were able to show there was the overall experience during treatment was enhanced. There was a change in improved trust towards the healthcare system. There wasn't, excuse me, but they felt that our navigators were culturally competent. And again, Linda B was critical in helping our staff, including myself. So the NCI wants two things from any NCI program. They want you to publish manuscripts and they want you to put people on clinical trials. And that's, what you're trying to do in SWOG, obviously. But before you get to this, what I would call frosting on the cake or the top of the pyramid, you have to go through this whole process to get there. And we'll walk through this a little bit more. Don't need to go through the rationale of clinical trials. You all know this. Historically, there still is a low participation rate. I was updating my slides during the talks, and I saw what your goal is. So I think that's worthwhile. We looked at the reasons that American Indians didn't participate in clinical trials because we screened everybody. The two main reasons were advanced stage of presentation or poor performance status, no trial available. And a lot of these patients were just too sick to go on study, even though we tried. So for an example of a study that would really met the needs of the population, when I moved here in 1999, the mastectomy rates were extraordinarily high. And why was that? We postulated maybe one of the reasons was distance from the cancer center. At that time, breast preservation meant a lumpectomy in 6 weeks, a whole breast radiation. Now it's down to 3 weeks. And with the studies coming out of Europe, it might be down to 5 days. So being a brachytherapist, I'll go back to that slide in a little bit. And this wasn't ready for prime time in 2003, but I had a lot of extensive brachytherapy experience with the radiation oncologist in the audience. There's the interstitial technique. There's the placement of a single entry portal device. But the rationale of the study is that if patients were eligible and if they were stage 1, they could go on this clinical trial, have their treatments completed in 5 days. This eligibility criteria for this were similar to what B39 was, but I want to back up a moment because one of the concerns in the community was, well, that's great. You're going to be out there promoting screening. IHS doesn't have the funding to cover this, but there's a separate program called All Women Count. And if women were diagnosed with cancer on this program, it's a breast and cervical screening project, their treatments would be paid for independent of IHS funding. So it does, in this particular trial, highlight the importance of screening. They're diagnosed with stage 1 disease. They're potentially eligible for this trial. So we enrolled 70 patients on this study using both interstitial, intracavitary, high rates of local control as you anticipate, low rates of grade 3 toxicities. Over time, that we were able to demonstrate that through the implementation of a dedicated breast navigator program and breast brachytherapy, that our breast preservation rates or conservation rates were similar to what they were from the SEER database. This study came out, interestingly, 10 years ago, showing high rates of breast brachytherapy utilization. And it was really the grant that drove this technology in addressing a community need. So that's middle of nowhere where I live, Western South Dakota. Another trial that we opened was, now this is standard of care in any radiation oncology practice, is intensity modulated radiation therapy, but we were one of 4 sites back in 2002 to implement tomotherapy. And this is an interesting story that when we implemented the machine, we had a medicine man came in, he blessed the machine. This is one of my staff and her folks. Her dad was actually treated for prostate cancer. But one of the most rapidly accruing trials that we opened back in the early days was a hypofractionated trial that would reduce the number of fractions from 38 to 22 to 16 to 12. And we enrolled 50 patients on this study because it really met the needs of the community. Rates of biochemical control, as you anticipate, are very high. There was about a 7% rate of grade 2 rectal bleeding. And there was some concern in my perspective, because when I was out here for the first couple of years, this is a bad radiation reaction in a Caucasian woman post-mastectomy radiation. there was this sense that American Indians might have higher rates of radiation toxicities. So one of the last studies that we implemented was looking at the ATM gene, which stands for ataxia telangiectated mutated gene. Now there's a mouthful. So this was the last study that we implemented because there was a real concern about doing a genetic study in a disparate population. So this is a relatively small study where we enrolled 100 Native Americans, 100 non-natives, and we wanted to look at, was there a difference in the SNP rate between the two populations? And we wanted to correlate that with radiation toxicities. The reality is that would probably take 10,000 patients to prove this. So we really didn't see any higher rate of SNP variance amongst the two populations. But I would say one of the successful parts of the study was the fact that they were very receptive to undergoing the study, having this done, and then per study design, we destroyed all the samples. We also had some prostate brachytherapy trials. I'm not going to get into this in the interest of time. These are the results from the 6 Cdrp sites through this program. Collectively, the 6 sites entered 2,300 patients over a 10-year period of time. This trial, this was published actually back in Frontiers in Oncology back in 2014. But the NCI wanted to collectively look at all of our data and find out why couldn't you put people on study. And similar to what we found here is very few of the cooperative group clinical trials had eligibility criteria suitable for the advanced stages of disease. The PI initiated and PI mentored initiated trials were successful in accrual. And at that time, attempts were made to go to the cooperative groups to look at advanced stage trials for patients that had poor performance status, but we weren't successful at that time. So now in the third phase of walking forward, we embedded a cancer screening coordinator within each clinic. And so this is the full circle. We now have a community navigation program talking about the importance of screening. We can refer them to a cancer screening coordinator and ultimately refer them for their diagnostic tests and hopefully shorten the duration from all these time 2 points when an effort to get patients hopefully diagnosed as stage 2 or stage 1 or 2 versus stage 3 and 4 disease. So there's a huge effort in outreach for community education, screening. This again is part of a protocol. Patients could sign up for this study after they underwent this community education event. A lot of the cultural appropriateness was made possible by Dr. B, but we followed these patients until they had a normal screening test or it was abnormal, and then we try to expedite that process. So as of now, we've coordinated about 3,500 screenings. I want to talk a little bit about lung cancer, just about 2 or 3 minutes here, but we have the highest death rates from lung cancer. There's high smoking rates. And so we were able to, we just finished another study here looking at increasing rates of LDCT utilization by targeting primary care providers and individual interventions. The study is now complete. And what we've done is, at this point, historically, probably less than 1% of American Indians have undergone an LDCT for lung cancer screening. We've now had about 309 referrals, 232 are completed. I'm just giving you the high level overview, and I'm happy to take questions on this particular project. But if we're looking at patients who want to go on clinical trials, we're going to be much more successful if they're diagnosed with earlier stages of disease. And now things have changed with lung cancer, with all the immunotherapy, all the targeted agents. So you could think of this project as a lung health project, from helping people to quit smoking, to screening, to early stage detection, and then getting people on clinical trials. Not surprising, there's a lack of palliative care. I think Dr. Bell or Dr. B talked about there's no word for clinical trials. There's no word for palliative care in Lakota communities. And so this is another R01 that we have up and running. This is a partnership with Katrina Armstrong at MGH Harvard. And our CABs came up with this phrase of living well with serious illness. But the overarching goal of this project is to develop and test a multi-pronged strategy for delivery of palliative care within these communities. In all phases of this project, we're in phase 2, is really to implement a model of patient navigation for those who require palliative services. This is our team located in Western South Dakota. That's my alarm telling me to wrap it up here. Our key collaborators have been Dr. Coleman, Dr. Burhan-Stipanoff, and Dr. Guadagnolo. And this is our vision and our mission. I'm not going to read to you. And I think I'm going to wrap up there out of the interest of time, because I know it's about 6:39 your time and you're all probably getting hungry and thirsty. I'm going to skip on the ABS thing, that other than what I want to highlight briefly is Nationally, what we see going on is there's a decrease in the number of competent brachytherapists coming out of training. As ABS president, we implemented a program called 310, and the goal is to train 30 competent brachytherapy teams per year over the next 10 years through a multi-phase program. This is critical for the treatment, successful treatment for women of cervical cancer. I would say it's also critical for the management of prostate cancer. We just published this, or I published this a couple months ago, talking about the 310 initiative. And I do want to almost wrap up with this summary slide on keys to enrolling minorities to clinical trials through the lens of what I'd say walking forward. Community presence to assess their needs, ongoing community presence to establish trust, staff training to establish cultural competency. I really like the phrase that Dr. Bell used. I just updated my slides. Trials, research need to align with the needs of the community. Patient navigation is critical. I know SWOG is still involved a lot in neoadjuvant, adjuvant trials for prostate cancer. But if you are a SWOG trial, you can open up these 2 NRG trials, which does have brachytherapy as a component to dose escalation. And I am going to finish with a few admonitions. My favorite one is Dr. Coleman's, and that is, if you can't fix the problem, make it bigger. So that's one of our adages. You can think about that. So thank you very much. Seen from the Black Hills, and I'm sorry if I went over a little bit. And I'll quit sharing my screen here.
For that, Dr. Peter Wright, and we're going to go ahead and open up for question and answer right now.
I have one question that I was going to pose real quickly is, can you talk about the collection of blood and or tissue, how you address that and explain that, and special considerations around the American Indian? And I'll pose that to Dr. Peter Wright or Dr. B.
Dr. B, you go first. Nice to see you. I haven't seen you in a while.
I know it's been too long, Dan. You have to, if you're doing it in an Indian Health Service facility or a tribal owned facility, and on tribal lands, you have to make certain it's in compliance with what the local research committee says. Now, I'm saying research committee, not IRB, because there are only a few tribes that actually have accredited IRBs, but they have research committees. There are some tribes that they don't care if you take blood. And especially they don't care for prenatal care if you do a genetic test. When it's done on an adult, there are different issues. And that's where you want to have somebody who's trusted in the community where you can do it. You need to talk about where the specimen is being stored, who has access to it, and if it's looking at a priority that the tribe has determined to be a priority. There are so many studies that we're asked to take part and give genetic specimens, and we receive things with FedEx envelopes saying, put your specimen in here, and then we'll tell you where you came from. They're looking at mitochondrial DNA. And it's like, I know where I came from. We have our tribal stories. We know where we came from. So I'm not interested in what this person's doing. Plus, they don't know anything about me. Why'd I get this? And why didn't my sister, get this? So you really have to work one-on-one with the tribes to be very respectful to their beliefs and to their priorities. And you can come up with very good win-win situations. Francine Gauchapin has been very active in all the ethical issues for IRBs for decades in Indian country. And she's got an R21 now, or I think she's got an R01 now that's looking at kidney cancer in American Indians, because in the Southwest, we have very, very high rates and we don't understand a lot of what's happening with this. But because of how she is welcomed in the community, how she is respected, people are very willing to take part and give genetic specimens. So again, it gets back to the trust that Daniel and Ronnie, actually all three of us have talked about. You have to have a partnership and trust.
So in the ATM study, that was relatively straightforward because these were American Indian cancer patients that were undergoing radiation, and I already had an established relationship with them. And so we, posed the question is, would you be interested in participating in this trial? We draw some blood, we send it to the University of Wisconsin, it's stored in a very secured environment. We needed to destroy that DNA by protocol design. And so they're very receptive to that. Now that we're getting into next generation sequencing, boy, it would sure have been nice to go back and look at all that DNA to look at all this, but obviously that would be very appropriate. I see you're shaking your head, Linda. That was all destroyed. But here's like one of the most extreme examples of, it's called, I don't know if you know who Dr. Amy Elliott is, and she's one of my research collaborators with Avera. They did a study called Safe Passage, and what it was, and correct me if I'm wrong, Linda, the correct name, but it was a SID study for those children that died prematurely. And what they did with this trial is they actually did autopsies on these kids to find out what was going on. And if you can imagine the amount of IRB that was required and the trust, and then they would have a ceremony for these children after they did was just looking at their, their brains. I mean, it was a very important question, but to get to that point that they actually could do this study is almost stunning. I mean, Linda, you might want to comment on that, and Ronnie as well.
Ronnie, did you want to comment?
Go ahead.
No, it's just, so often we talk about what doesn't go well, and what you have an example of here in particular with Daniel's programs, it's really is a model for how to create a long-term project. When I'm out in Pine Ridge, Rosebud, any of the different areas, and we start talking about cancer, because we have the largest cancer survivorship network of Indigenous people actually in the world. And when Daniel's name comes up, they are, oh, he's doing it. Okay. They don't even want any more information. I say, wait, it's going to be a clinical trial. These are other things that you want to know, and you'll get a chance to talk to him. And they're like, oh yeah, we've heard good things. That says that, I mean, our moccasin telegraph is so efficient. And, so something that he's taken years to develop the trust. But again, that's why I say it's not a quick thing. It's a long-term process. It's a partnership. And it works. It works.
And I would give the credit to people like you, Linda, who have trained us, our staff. I mean, and being very humble about this, but I mean, it's really because of our community presence. They're all Lakota. I didn't show this picture, but one of my Native friends it shows a picture of he and I in my office, and I use it as an example of he's my sounding board, and Larry's looking at me like, I don't think that's a good idea, Doc. You need to try that a different way. So we're always adapting to, I would say, community signals, and Linda's kept us on spot to make certain that, and it's accountability. I mean, I see these people and I go, patients, when I go to the lake, the grocery store, it's one of the advantages of living in Western South Dakota. It's a small net community, but if you're doing a bad job, you're going to hear about it.
Oh yeah.
Dr. B and Dr. Peterite and Dr. Bell, we've got a question from Dr. Hirschman.
Yeah, so I was really taken aback at, a lot of things in the presentations. It wasn't too surprising to me that it's the population science studies that are easier to accrue to, probably, screening and prevention and cohort studies and things along those lines, because there are less structural barriers and more patients that are usually eligible for those studies. So in thinking about that and thinking about like the major structural barriers that prevent patients from going on studies, often it's not being close enough to a center, as you had pointed out with some of those brachytherapy trials. So in terms of trying to think of solutions to that, I guess I'd like to know what your thoughts are. And despite the fact that, you were saying that there's not great internet, are there ways that we can use modern technologies to bring trials closer to patients, to figure out how to increase access? Like, what solutions can we put forward to break down those structural barriers?
Dan, do you want to go first?
I guess one of my gripes in the last 10 years about, and I'll get shot for saying this, but I know NRG, SWOG, you do have radiation trials, but we're not we might be expensive, but we're not a sexy drug. And I don't think there's been a huge interest in looking at radiation trials, especially there are some interesting biologic issues to use radiation as a chemosensitizer or a radiosensitizer for chemo with the immunotherapy trials. I mean, I guess I would like to see at the cooperative group trial, and again, we don't have a lot of pharma. I mean, we're talking about external beam and brachytherapy. I guess I would like to at least like to see a few more studies being asked. And I guess they would be in the SBRT realm with oligometastatic disease. But I think there's been, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's been kind of a de-emphasis on really asking a lot of radiation questions.
And in terms of distance, is an issue for urban Indians as well, because they may have to take 13 bus routes to get to the cancer clinic to go in for care. And when we work with our patients and we're talking about, there's this great clinical trial, but it's 200 miles away. And how, if you were interested in this, how would that work? How would you get there? Oh, my daughter would drive me. Well, your daughter works. She's going to lose her job if she's driving you back and forth all the time. Well, you know what? That's not a big deal. We can find transportation programs that would bring people in. When we talk to people, those practical issues are not real barriers. People are willing to do it. They want to live. They want to have a chance to have high quality and high quantity life. So I think a lot of times we see the practical barriers, and there are a slew of them, definitely. But when you actually provide access, a path that people can get to and take part and complete a clinical trial, they're willing to do it. So I think we make up some excuses that we just need to be a little bit more respectful of how valuable somebody's time is. They're a housewife. Well, wait a minute, what does that really mean in Indian country? How many kids are they taking care of, and how many grandchildren and great-grandchildren? And so we need to be more respectful of time, but also to find resources that, okay, we're going to get a community health representative, and she's going to drive you up to Monument Hospital where Daniel's working from Denver, because maybe we can't find that clinical trial in Denver. And I'll tell you, our people will do it. So I don't think the barriers are the issue. I think it's how we approach them. And I think we can do a better job. And we see examples of that, right here.
We have a question from Dr. Berenberg.
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay.
If you're in an area where you're not seeing a large number of people from, let's say, Native American, Indian, and you come across, let's say, an individual patient, how do you establish the trust? And do you working with them? How important is their family if they don't have, let's say, access or much contact with their tribe? Because from a practical point of view, a lot of us will be seeing individuals on that basis. Thank you.
Yeah, that actually is why we set up contracts with some cancer centers, and we do it a per hour, how many hours our native sister or native brother is working with the patient and working with somebody who's at that cancer center. So they create a relationship with the patient, and they help the patient get more comfortable with where they are. Now we're small. And we're not in all communities. So sometimes especially since COVID, we're forced to using the telephone on it. I get calls all the time that we have a patient, she's really upset. She just found out she has lymphoma. She doesn't know what it is. We tried to explain it. We can't do it. And I said, that's fine. Let's do a 3-way call. And we'll set up a time to do it all together. And then usually the patient will talk with either Linda Krebs, who's an oncology nurse who works very closely with our program, and myself. Lisa Harjo is executive director of our nonprofit, and we do the majority of those types of conversations. Then when I'm confused, which happens often, I'll call somebody I trust, like Judith Cower. I'll call Daniel Peter Wright, And I'll say, the patient's asking these things, it's for this type of thing. What do you think? And we'll get clarification. And I'll talk to the recruiter. So it's several steps frequently to do it, but it can be done. And again, it's not limited to just American Indian, Alaska Native people. It's African American, it's Latinos, it's Vietnamese, Thai, it's all these different underrepresented, gay, lesbian, questioning, sexual identity people who are underserved and under-included in clinical trials, people with disabilities. So I think a lot of these suggestions go beyond just, our indigenous population. Ronnie, you look like you had something you wanted to say.
Well, no, I was just gonna say that I think it's important to have an understanding and appreciation of the culture in which these patients are coming from. It can be a matter of, as you see in the patient record, if this person is American Indian, to be mindful of that, to be respectful of if you're living near a community, near a tribal community, to understand, the cultural nuances of that tribal community. So I know at our institution we have there's a program called Culture Vision in the electronic health system, and you can look and see, you can sort of gather information about different populations that can be of benefit to you.
And, sometimes it also has to do with how questions are phrased, like collecting family history. There are a lot of tribes that if your parents have walked on or passed away, you're not supposed to use their name. And so when you're doing a health questionnaire, and you say something that's too direct, your mother, your father, and so on, if you have somebody else who knows the community, as Ronnie's suggesting, that if you really have somebody who's from that community and they can say, the woman whose womb you came from, how did she teach you these things? And you have other brothers and sisters. Did they come from the same womb? Because we spiritually adopt many other people, and she's my sister, and I don't care about blood. Well, you're doing a genetic study, you definitely care about blood. And so you get into some basics of that. And instead of asking if they passed on, it's like Frank Ducapoo before he walked on, unfortunately. But he used to say, so, the people who taught you how to be Indian, how are they doing, huh? And then they kind of say, oh, my dad, he does, blah, blah, blah. And they'll get into telling a story, and you'll start to answer the different questions that you need on your intake by letting the person tell a story and listening very carefully to what they say. So sometimes there's subtle things that can be done that help make the person feel more comfortable in taking part in what they're doing
we have two more questions. We have one from the virtual audience. I've been told that many American Indians choose not to self-identify as AI on a mission form when it is not required for access to service by IHS. Do you have any suggestions for encouraging patients to self-identify? And then we have another question from the audience.
I responded to that question, but if Linda or Daniel, if you want to answer that as well.
No, I would just say when I used to be with the Los Angeles American Indian Clinic back in the late 80s, early 90s, we had more people who identified as Hispanic, Chicano, Latino than American Indian because they felt they got better health care. And that was quite shocking, and it made us pull back and realize we had to do a better job with what we were doing. Most people will identify who they are if they trust the center, but it may take a while, and that's one of the reasons why you have problems with data, because maybe 5 years ago this person was white, and now on their form, now they're American Indian. Well, how'd they suddenly become American Indian? It drives demographers nuts with this, but it's usually because people didn't feel that they could trust the clinical setting well enough to say what their racial identity is.
Go ahead. Last question.
Okay, just thank you to this panel because this has been a great program. My name is Hildy Dillon and I serve as the patient advocate on our lymphoma committee at SWOG. I have a question in that so much of what you're talking about in terms of the programs that you've developed and the strategies have to do with navigation and being cognizant of the culture. But we all know with clinical trials, there's a lot of documentation that's very, very threatening to all patients. And part of our job as advocates is to review these documents like consent documents and make recommendations to make that language more appropriate and understandable by most patients. And so have you published or is there a glossary of phrases or terms that we need to be aware of? You talked about we can't really change the term clinical trial, but we can explain the term clinical trial. So those strategies would be very helpful to us because we can't avoid these legal documents. They have to be presented to the patient. So how can we make them most friendly and understandable?
I think the most frequently used document is the Navajo Glossary, and they provide Navajo phrases and the English words, and it would help you begin to see how some concepts are translated, even though Navajo is 1 out of 574 federally recognized tribes and the many hundred more that are state recognized. It still would give you a glimmer as to what's involved there. And of course, you have to fill out the legal papers. I mean, that's essential for anything. But again, we use our navigators along with patient advocates, along with nurse advocates and nurse navigators that they can go through and explain things. And sometimes they will talk in their native tongue. We have 217 indigenous languages still spoken in the United States. So you're not going to have a translator in the hospital who speaks all these languages. I mean, I realize it's a federal law, but it's kind of a bogus law when it comes to small communities like mine. But the navigator can do it. And you can have people like in Daniel's program, Michelle Sargent is a nurse. She's the clinical navigator for a lot of the programs. She's worked with the community so much. She phrases things in very gentle, welcoming ways that it's okay to really have a discussion rather than somebody going you know, or yes and no. And that's critical in these papers, that there really is a discussion of risks. And again, that takes some comfort. And it takes some practice too. So we do some role playing. Linda Krebs and I actually have a series where we show bad ways to talk about clinical trials and good ways. And we had a heck of a time doing it because Linda automatically does things in a better way. And we're like, no, Linda, you're supposed to be doing it bad. You're supposed to be showing it's not the right way to do it here. But I think that's really good to practice. And patient advocates, you know, you're protecting the clinic, you're also protecting the patient. So you've got to have some of those gentle ways of phrasing and interacting with people.
I want to thank our panelists. I saw so many comments on the chat line as well about how qualified Dr. Bell, Dr. B, and Dr. Peterwright were to give us a brief overview on this topic. And I have used them to do a project that we did through SCORE because we found out we had one county with 40% American Indians, and we were shocked. So we reached out to them to help us in a cultural framework, and Dr. B connected us to Dr. Bell, and we went out and engaged that community where they lived. So I expect for all of you to reach out, learn where your populations are, and thank you. Dr., you want to tell them about the ongoing activities?
Sure. I just wanted to highlight one additional diversity, equity, and inclusion presentation that's coming up. It's with the GU committee, and it's on Saturday between 12 and 2. And it is a symposium that is entitled Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in GU Oncology and SWOG. And so please, more diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are going on. Please, if you're here on Saturday afternoon, please partake in that as well. And we thank all of our awesome presenters, Dr. Bell, Dr. Peter Wright, and Dr. B for this great presentation. And we appreciate the time that you have spent. And we thank everyone in the virtual audience as well as our in-person audience. Thank you all so much.